Okay, today we're going to be talking about the biological perspective. We've got a whole week to spend on this, and 2 slides actually involved. The first one focuses on our brain and nervous system. Brain, and this is the nervous system that runs throughout our body. So just a reminder that when we think about the biological perspective, we're looking at the many ways that our biology influences our psychology. So that sounds kind of like gobbledygook unless you break it down into how does our biology influence the way we think, feel, and behave. We're using our informal definition of psychology there, and then it starts to make sense, and we can think about things like genetics and epigenetics. Epigenetics is one of the recent findings of the last decade that's just amazing. Things like brain structures, our spinal cord and nerves, which are really just extensions of our brain, enabling our brain to run through our whole body, which is what is happening here. And this is the oldest part of our brain, really, right? Because these earliest brain structures and everything before the thinking parts are shared by reptiles and mammals and other movement-based beings. We have neurochemistry like hormones and neurotransmitters that we're just beginning to learn about. And then we have our sensory and perceptual systems that are all part of the biological perspective, but sensation and perception gets its own chapter. And we actually do it a little bit later, connecting it to children, because it's, again, kind of heavy in this biological terminology, and so it's nice to kind of go in another direction for a little while and make connections to the brain structures you're going to learn about because they're so implicated in things like anxiety and different kinds of difficult emotions that are implicated in the psychological disorders, right? Like negative emotions, the spectrum of negative emotions. So there are 2 slideshows in this unit. Both of them are a little over an hour long. So this one is on the brain and nervous system, and the second slideshow looks at neural structures, neurons, a little bit about how neurons work, probably some review for some of you, but also some new stuff like about mirror neurons, which are pretty amazing phenomena that enable us to immediately tell what somebody else is feeling looking at their facial expressions, because mirror neurons in our brain read those facial expressions and literally mimic what the other person's feeling in our own brain. And then the second thing, oops, I'm going ahead, is epigenetics, which is another recent finding that our genetics, our genes actually have little tags that are influenced by environmental factors. And some of us have some tags and other people have other tags. And so very personal how we each are. And typo, can and does. The environment can and does change our genetics in various ways because we all have different tags. We don't have the same ones. So this is a fascinating new thing, right? So we're just constantly learning more, and we're in a big explosion about learning because of technology relative to this, which is only about 20 years old, maybe a little bit more now. Okay, so you can think of your brain and nervous system, and again, we've got our brain and then all these nerves that run through our body, or what are referred to as the nervous system, as like the operating system, your operating system. And we're going to get a little bit of a primer on that operating system and of the sort of, we could say the computer of your body-mind system, but that's not really a fair term because just like it says here, you know, we are massively different from a machine, and it's very difficult for artificial intelligence people to be able to even begin to replicate, you know, what we do, because we're, as it points out here, a constantly changing system within a moderately stable framework. It's not a completely stable framework, our body, right? Because the framework of our body does age and change over time and begin to break down, say, later in life. But it is moderately stable, and we're capable of learning and generating diverse responses to an environment that is also a constantly changing system within a moderately stable framework. You know, the earth, the sun rises and sets each day, and so on. So it is a completely genius system, you know, just an absolutely amazing system, and super exciting to begin to be able to learn so much about it now. I just absolutely love this stuff. Okay, so let's get a little bit of a context. This is a good context to prepare us also for the sensation and perception chapter, which comes up, not for a while, second half of the semester actually. But the context that you sort of intuitively know that is reflected in the yin-yang system, and that our system is designed to work and function within, and that is the context of chaos and order. That we're in a system that is moderately stable, but also always changing. And in that moderately stable system, homeostasis is the term for the body's attempt to achieve balance in a constantly changing system. And for example, we get hungry, and so we get motivated to go get some food so that our body can re-experience a state of homeostasis. And we get thirsty and we need something to drink, same thing. We get tired, right? We have a sleep drive that hits because our body needs to achieve a state of homeostasis or balance. And the brain actually does a lot while we're sleeping. You know how, at least in our neighborhood, the trash gets collected early in the morning before we're awake, and while we're sleeping, the brain is pruning, our brain is pruning neurons that don't need to be there, that we've picked up during the day. It's solidifying things you've learned, and doing a bunch of emotional healing too. Lots of amazing things are happening when we sleep and dream in our brain. It's actually very busy during that period. So we need our sleep. So that our brain is sort of like the cleanup crew, comes out and vacuums the halls and gets everything in order so that we can function well the next day. I know in the classroom we have a cleanup crew that comes and does that. All right, so that's establishing homeostasis for the next day in terms of our mind and moods, and why sleep can be really important to the brain. The yin-yang symbol, the initial ideas, it's a duality, right? Darkness and light. Day and night, and we have the idea of chaos and order in there too, right? So we need order, and we're constantly, homeostasis is the body's attempt to sustain a basic sense of order in a constantly changing system, so that we can never have a perfect sense of order for very long. And we humans, we get fooled into thinking that we want to, get everything together and have everything organized. And it's really good to try to achieve that sense of order and structure, because the orders and structures around us are what give us a sense of safety, right? And if there's too much chaos, like this Hurricane Irma here that's going on right now, and we have a bunch of destruction and fear and uncertainty, too much chaos is overwhelmed. Mentally, that's being overwhelmed, right? Too much chaos, and physically, we've got this great big hurricane, right? Here's a picture of a yin-yang of our, the system in which we live, Earth and Moon here. So the system of chaos and order constantly working back and forth together, right? And we have the same thing mentally. And when you think about the disorders like depression or anxiety, we're moving out of a sense of order and into more of a sense of chaos, and it influences our life, right? So the same thing with addictions and cognitive disorders like schizophrenia and stuff. So we need a certain sense of order, a certain amount of order for the system to function well. And the system has to be ready to deal with an environment that's always changing. So it has to be a very strong system. And our ancestors have survived for millions of years to develop this system that we inhabit right now. And it's actually an incredibly fascinating system to learn about, our operating system, how all of this works and functions. Here's the spinal cord, right? And all these nerves, and all these connect up to the brain. So this relates to our next point, which is our brain is distributed throughout our entire body. Okay? It's not just up there in your head. It's running through everything, and you're starting to hear these ideas, right? The brain in your gut and so on. Well, your brain is everywhere and is doing different things. So the nervous system is referred to in two ways. There's two basic parts. The first is the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord. And then the second is the peripheral nervous system, which consists of all the other nerves that run through your body. And we'll be looking quite a bit at the peripheral nervous system in different chapters, like the stress and health chapter, for example. So we'll learn quite a bit about the peripheral nervous system. But, you know, it's everything else that's gathering data and also enabling us to experience both involuntary and voluntary movement, right? Dribble the basketball or breathe, all those things. All right, so we're going to be looking in this slideshow in particular at the human brain, you know, sort of the, let's say, one of the chief executive officers of the nervous system, though not the only one, as you've learned about the stomach being the second brain. And what we have here is something that early scientists were able to see and understand about the brain, and like, because they could take a brain out of somebody who'd passed away and look at it and see that it had these different, you know, that it has this curly gray matter on the outside that most of us think of it as the brain. And then they would break it up into like different organizational structures so they could refer to it. This is like, pretend this is the United States and we're saying, okay, this is the West Coast and this is the East Coast. Well, that's what they are, but they call them lobes. So this is the frontal lobe. This is the heart behind the forehead. The eye would go here. See the eye right here. Okay, so this is the frontal lobe. Down here is the temporal lobe. Okay, up here is what's called the parietal lobe, and this is the occipital lobe. So we'll talk about the lobes later in another slideshow, actually, a little bit more, because we're going to look at a different way of thinking about the brain in this slideshow than this exterior part of the lobes and what the functions are with these. We'll do a little bit of it. Occipital lobe is where vision is, back here. That's where our vision is processed. And a huge amount of our brain goes to processing vision. Odd that it's in the back of the brain. That's a rather strange thing, wouldn't you say? That that vision is processed in the back of the brain. So it's got to go all the way from the eye, all the way to back here. And you can see we have two hemispheres of the brain. This is called the left hemisphere, and over here would be the right hemisphere. In between them, they show you this. This is the corpus callosum. That's like a bridge between the two hemispheres where the two hemispheres talk. And you can also see in here that we have a whole bunch of really weird looking structures in here. Okay, strange looking structures that are very different looking than, say, the curly gray matter, which here they've colored up. So we want to learn about these structures because they're very related to, this is where our primal emotions are in our brain, is in the middle of the brain. These are structures we share with mammals down here and are referred to as the limbic system. And then down here, these structures down here, the pons, spinal cord, medulla, cerebellum, these are reptilian structures that reptiles have. So in the 1990s, the idea of the three-part brain was introduced when we were able to identify some of the activities and behaviors of these different structures, and that reptiles have these structures, mammals have these structures, as well as some cerebral cortex, the exterior gray matter. But we have them in a more developed form, and we obviously have all of evolution in our brain. So neuroscience is a relatively new science over the last, say, 30 years. Took a leap in the 1990s because it enabled us, by putting people into these PET scans, to be able to, for the first time ever, see what the brain is doing while we are doing different things and while we're still alive, right? So we can watch what's happening in the brain when people do different things. And they put people in these PET scans and have them do all kinds of things, emotional things, mental things. Here you can see them listening, hearing words, speaking words, thinking about words, and seeing words. So they're inside the PET scan, the PET fMRI, and they ask them to do these different things. They'll say words, and then they'll watch what part of the brain lights up, and they do these things. So you can see here it's red means it's really lit up. So you can see that there's a lot of light lit up here going on in this part of the brain for listening to words. And that makes sense because, you know, your ear's about here. So speaking words, more in the front of the brain, okay, up here. Thinking about words, ooh, look at that. This is in the very prefrontal lobes of the brain. This is how the brain's situated. So This is always the front, and then this would be the back here. And then seeing, remember that occipital lobe is in the back of the word, so processing vision is back here, and you can see that the red is lit up there, right? Now this is very simplified because it's obviously the brain is processing, seeing words in different places other than just the occipital lobe, but they're simplifying this to help point out the part of the brain that's most active in order to do that, and how they can begin to map what's going on in the brain and see what is happening. When we mentally process information, it's in the prefrontal lobes. Whenever we're processing visual information, it's in the occipital lobe, in the back of the brain, right? And then we have the parietal lobe here and the temporal lobe here. So this is an image of before and after winning the lottery, and if we just notice that there is a lot more, now, you know, students pointed out, really, seriously, did this really happen? No. Because what are they going to do? Give the person their winning lottery ticket while they're in the PET scan? So somebody is just sort of using this as some kind of example. But basically, we have a more excited brain over here and a less excited brain over here. And here we have, in the middle of the brain where we have a lot of emotion, first of all, we have a lot more red. Okay, and here we have less red. Okay, and so it's almost like in this brain, they're looking at the lottery ticket, processing it in the occipital lobe, and in this brain, they realize and they're thinking about, oh my gosh, I won, I can't believe it. And the middle of the brain, that where we have our primary emotions, is really lit up. So basically showing a lot more activity in the right side of the brain. Now we have the idea that I mentioned earlier, that we have 3 evolutionary layers of the brain. Here they're illustrating the hindbrain, midbrain, and forebrain. Cerebral cortex, forebrain, and some of the limbic structures are in the forebrain. In the midbrain, this is just a location thing, you know, again, a mapping location. We have more primitive limbic structures in the midbrain, and then in the hindbrain, that's the reptilian brain right there. So we're going to learn about what these different parts of the brain do, okay, because it's very interesting. So here's Paul MacLean's triune model of the brain with the reptilian brain, the limbic brain, emotional or feeling. Look at all these weird structures here we're going to be learning about, and then the neocortex. And unfortunately for the neocortex, they use different words like cerebral cortex, neocortex, cortical structures. So we just have to get familiar with the different kind of words they use for the cortex. Okay, so the R complex down here, as you can see, these are the same. This is the structures as they show in reptiles. So we have evolutionary history in our brain. And Paul MacLean at the Brain and Research Lab, one of the first brain and research labs for the National Institute of Mental Health, was the one who first identified this, or first started talking about this in psychology, this 3-part brain structural system, where we have reptilian aspects which, you know, are mostly responsible for movement and breathing. We have, you know, basic structures in here. As you can see, they regulate hunger, temperature control, fight or flight, and the ability to move. This is the cerebellum here is our movement machine that enables coordinated movement, for example. And then limbic system structures deep in the middle of the brain, and there are a whole bunch of little structures there like the amygdala and hippocampus that we'll learn about that are related to emotion and emotional feeling that help regulate mood, memory, and hormone control. We share these with dogs, cats, and mice, which is why mice in particular that work well, because they have these limbic systems. Now, limbic systems are social systems. So reptiles don't usually have a social system, and limbic mammals have social. They often interact with each other, work in groups, take care of young until they're older, and things like that. Dogs have a limbic system that's very attuned to ours, and then the neocortex, which is this outer layer of the brain, okay, and regulates logic and thought required for complex social situations shared with monkeys and chimpanzees. And other animals have very thin layers of the neocortex too. So let's look at the first layer of the brain, what is often referred to as the R complex, or the reptilian brain. This is, I think, a gecko, right? Maybe a gecko or a lizard. Anyway, these are the main structures. This is a call out of its location. Top of the spinal cord. This is the cerebellum here, not to be confused with the cerebrum, which is all this gray matter here. So, ellum, bellum, bella, 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 bella. That's Italian for, I think, beautiful or something like that. Anyway, cerebellum, when you see the L's, that's the structures back here behind your neck that enable coordinated movement, like my wiggling around of this mouse, right? And you just got to think about alligators and lizards. Notice that territorialism is a very reptilian, sort of behavior. So it comes from a really primitive part of our brain. And by primitive, we shouldn't think less intelligent, because it's obviously a highly intelligent system. We can think less thoughtful and more automatic reflexive, right, but not necessarily intelligent. So realize that your reptilian complex is an incredibly intelligent system and one of the oldest part of our brains. And when we react extremely fast in emergency situations, we've often dropped right down into that R complex, and certainly when we're in a position of having to be at war or something, we move people in reptilian complex kind of space or state in the brain. We can actually have trauma stored down there too. Then we have the next level of the brain, which is called the limbic system, or the mammal brain. Dogs share this with us. In fact, they're very limbically attuned with us. And the limbic system refers to all these structures that are in the center of the brain. Some of them are in the midbrain, some of them in their forebrain, just to confuse you. So we're not going to talk that much about hindbrain, midbrain, forebrain. We're going to talk about reptilian brain, limbic system, and cerebral cortex, because the interplay of these three very different sets of structures, how they dialogue and communicate, it plays a big role in how we behave, as you'll soon see. Okay, so the limbic system is the source of our core and most primal emotions, and these are them, right? So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Mad, sad, glad, fear, disgust, contempt, and love, bonding. Notice they use terms like bonding and attachment rather than love. So I put love in there for now, but love is more abstract, harder to specifically measure than, say, being able to measure whether two animal creatures are bonded or not, right? So it's harder for us to for sure say that they love each other, but we can measure their attachment, and we can identify. It's easier to basically define. So we have these limbic structures that we share with other mammals, and some have them more developed. These are social structures. Notice how you can immediately tell what that dog is feeling, just instantly, and that's because this part of your brain is interpreting those feelings. It's actually kind of feeling a little bit about what this dog is feeling. It's triggering a micro feeling of that within you, and the part of your brain that's doing that are mirror neurons in your limbic system. I mentioned mirror neurons that are just sort of replicating the feeling of this dog inside of you. And of course, some people have more of an abundance of mirror neurons and so on. And so you instantly know what this animal is feeling, right? And so you can see how valuable that is for communication between infant and parent, or infant and, infant and parent, or between human beings, let's say two hunters working on opposite ends of a prairie, be able to signal through facial expressions their feelings and their needs, just like you can see in the animals doing here, as well as the human faces. And we have the same facial expressions. You can see the happy facial expression of positive feelings in the human and the chimp and the dog and, you know, the lifting up of the corners of the mouth is something that we do have in common. And now, yes, of course, dogs do that also when they pant, but they also do it when they're happy. And you can see here the similar crunching of the nose, furrowing of the brow that happens, and the baring of the teeth that happens with anger, and then the V-shaped brow of worry and fear, the corners of the mouth going down, okay, concern, sorrow, all right? So you can recognize these facial expressions instantly because of the mirror neurons in your limbic system. You don't have to think a single thought about them. Now, what's interesting is that in autistic kids, one of the things that we notice is that they're unable to interpret these facial expressions. So one of the things that we definitely know is going on there is a little bit of a disruption in the mirror neuron system, right? They can learn to interpret these facial expressions by having them described. You know, when somebody's brow is furrowed like this and they curl their nose up and you see their teeth and they're mad, but sometimes they're not able to interpret them. In fact, they can see these kinds of facial expressions as basically confusing, and so one of the reasons why they don't want to look at faces is because of the feeling of confusion. All right, so now we have the cerebral cortex. This is the part of the brain that you usually think of as your brain. Down here, this is not the cerebral. This is the cerebellum, right? That's a strange in the spinal cord. So this is still the R complex. But here, this curly gray, it's actually gray and white matter, and it's both of those. So it's got not just gray matter, but what we tend to be able to see is the gray matter. And this cerebral cortex here, we have the lobes again, frontal, temporal, parietal, and occipital. Remember, vision's back here in the occipital lobes. We'll just try to learn the occipital and the frontal right now because we want to focus on those. Vision. And frontal lobes we talk about a lot because the frontal lobes is where thought occurs, words. This is the part of the brain that just did a massive growth spurt in human beings. In the parietal lobe, we have movement, you know, and our sensory, somatosensory cortex. Very interesting to look at that and how it's laid out up here in the parietal lobe. Down here in the temporal lobe, we have hearing, right? But in the frontal lobe, this is where self-awareness is, thinking, planning, strategizing, impulse control, calming down the emotions that are generated by the limbic system, calming these emotions down. Those come, you know, the brakes on the brain, self-discipline, self-control. These are all neural structures in the frontal lobe, and these can be built like a muscle. And the links from the frontal lobe to the limbic system, those neural structures can be developed over time. So we're talking about the prefrontal lobe here again still, which is often referred to as the executive center of the brain, because it enables us to calm impulses from deep the limbic system within our brain, again involved with thinking, planning, strategizing. So this is the great human leap here, is a highly developed cerebral cortex. Whales also have a highly developed cerebral cortex, but we don't know what they do with it. You know, what we have is thumbs that we can move and grip and move and manipulate the environment, which is the different thing that we have than there's a couple of other animals, as well as our speech and language center. So the opposable thumb and these which gives us the ability to manipulate the environment, and the prefrontal lobes, which gives us the ability to simulate possible futures and come up with ideas and ways to manipulate the environment. Those are two of the big physiological, biological leaps that enable us to do what we're able to do. Now let's take a closer look at the limbic system, because it's the interplay. Here's the prefrontal lobes. There's the back of the brain, spinal cord, R complex down here. Here we have the prefrontal lobes here, and we have the limbic system. So remember, you have your primary emotions being triggered from the limbic system. And say you get mad, somebody cuts you off in traffic, and that's actually territorialism, so it can stem from way down here, right, that you're annoyed, and it triggers fight or flight in the amygdala. Now there's fight or flight down here in the R complex too, but the fight or flight is mainly processed for us in the amygdala. These two little organs here that are about the size of an almond, that's what amygdala means, and refers to one of the sources of the word for almond is amygdala. So you have these two little bulbs here, one on each side of the brain. And the amygdala is not just the center of fight or flight. It's also lights up when we fall in love and other, when we are feeling excited, when we're feeling passionate about something, when we're having a really great time. The amygdala lights up. But its primary, it considers its primary function to keep us alive, to keep us safe. So it's always, to some extent, scanning the environment for threat. And if you look at animals in the animal kingdom, like I was driving home and I saw a couple of deer, and I wanted to watch and follow them, but I noticed right away that they were getting afraid, and so they were running. And so animals, our limbic system, our threat assessment system is very important. It's the part that keeps us alive, right? Now, it's also, if it's hyperactive, going to be a source of anxiety, and we don't want that now with our more kind of in control worlds that we live in. But we're all born, if you imagine the distribution curve here, the bell curve, right? So most people are going to have an average amygdala, and some people are going to have a highly sensitive amygdala, and some people are going to have a less sensitive amygdala, and those guys will be risk takers, right? So, and these guys will be anxious people, right? And that's just being born. And then the environment interacts with that preset point, right? And it can move it up or down the scale. So somebody who's born over here, highly anxious with an enlarged amygdala and so on and so forth, is not probably going to go all the way down to be the biggest risk taker in the whole world, but they can certainly, in the right kind of environment, and that environment would not be for the environment to be constantly calm, right? Because all that would do would prepare that person for being able to survive in an environment that was only constantly calm. And if the environment, which it never is constantly calm, it's always changing, and stuff happens, and difficult stuff happens all the time. And so what we have to do is build courage, right? So, but you want to incrementally build courage and not overwhelm them in the building of courage, right? So we push ourselves, and the amount to push ourselves is about 10% over our current threshold, right? Enough so that we're not feeling overwhelmed, but we're feeling challenged, and that's what you want to do with your kids. Help them face challenges and experiences so they feel a sense of success and accomplishment, and they build courage incrementally over time, right? Just like that. So that puts the person more over here so they can function well in the world. And the risk taker, you want them to feel a little fear, right? People who feel no fear will put themselves into dangerous situations too much and too often. Now, it's not just fear, it's fear and anger in the amygdala, fight or flight. And the way we respond to anger and fear is to fight, flight, or freeze, right? Freezing is whenever you have, you're overwhelmed by what's going on, and so you just avoid your work. That's a form of freezing, and we can push ourselves out of it. Now, the prefrontal lobes interact with these primal emotions that surface. So somebody cuts you off in traffic, and your prefrontal lobes say, hey, it's not worth it for us to get upset over somebody cutting us off in traffic. That just produces stress hormones throughout our whole body and makes our tummy upset. So let's not do that. Let's chill. And you calm yourself down. That is the system, okay? We build a system from the prefrontal lobes to the limbic system. And people who don't have that system built, who those neural structures to calm themselves down aren't built, you can build them over time, and you can build them from where you are now and make them stronger throughout your entire life. That's what things like meditation and yoga and Tai Chi and all kinds of things do. They help build these calm down neural structures in our brain. Many different kinds of trainings to help us do that, right? So we can always build these structures. They initially get built in childhood, but say you're in an environment where everybody's always upset. Say you're born and you're a little bit agitated, amygdala system is already a little larger, and then you're in an environment where people are freaking out all the time. Well, then this is just going to become a hyperinflamed system, and your set point for normal is going to become to be sort of constantly agitated. Can you retrain that system? Yes. Yes, you can, and that's the great news, right? By becoming more self-aware and training these neural structures from the prefrontal lobe to go in and calm down the system. And of course, that's what happens in therapy and PTSD too, right? We're helping to dislodge stored trauma in these limbic system structures and connect it with the prefrontal lobes. A lot of times with PTSD, you've got it lodged in here in these early structures, and there's not a useful, productive connection between the prefrontal lobes and the limbic system. In fact, so that it's resolved, so it's integrated throughout the entire brain, and it's almost like the whole brain shares the trauma, and then you grow stronger than the trauma that's stored right there. So that's why talking about it is one of the processes that in a controlled environment helps people move through trauma. Although not talking about it too soon, because that can cement it in. So there's a bit of an art to it. All right, here we go. The amygdala, here it is, the amygdala, two little points in the middle of the brain. In limbic, one of the words that's associated with limbic is rings, so there are rings-like set of structures, and one of those ring-like set of structures is the hippocampus. And I always think of a hippopotamus walking around campus. This is learning, the hippocampus is. And notice how, you know, the amygdala, which is your internal century, also, you know, your internal passion center, right? So that you can feel really positive, passionate emotions too, like love and excitement about your work and feeling a calling and so on, all come from, well, they don't all come, but this is one of the central areas. But again, as your internal century, that's its #1 job, and it can be hyperactive, but we can train it to be calmer. In fact, people who don't have good neural circuits from the prefrontal lobe to the limbic system, and they have a temper tantrum as an adult and they can't calm themselves down, end up in prison, right? So the hippocampus is emotional learning. It's learning, period, but also emotional learning. So learning, like continued learning, is what we need to do throughout our lives, and we can get stuck in our learning. So we get stuck in our learning with, for example, little Albert learns to be afraid of the mouse, and it gets stuck there. And he goes to a therapist later and he says, look, every time my girlfriend wears this white faux fur coat, you know, I get all anxiety ridden, and I have no idea why. Let's say he did this as an adult. And the idea that learning that white fur is dangerous got stuck in here, and what we have to learn is past that. We have to learn a new idea that I can tolerate white fur coat, you know, that I have more courage. And we're basically building new neural structures that aren't there previously. And the ability to build new neural structures that aren't there previously, that we refer to as learning new things, is made possible by the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is, you know, an odd structure, but an amazing structure, and it's damaged by stress. Undue adrenaline, too much adrenaline and cortisol over a long period of time will damage the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is regenerated by exercise, particularly by, you know, good short bursts of intensity cardio exercise. So get out there and move your body, everybody, because it releases adrenaline and cortisol, and it helps build these hippocampus. And we all need to keep learning and growing so that we can continually realize that we can keep getting stronger, right? Okay, so you probably had a chance now to read this bit of information on these slides about differences. Now, this is just a slide that talks about how some of the limbic system is in the midbrain and some of the structures are in the forebrain. So just a reminder that we have, you know, some early terminology, hindbrain, midbrain, forebrain, but we're mostly focusing on the hindbrain reptilian complex, the limbic system, which is in both the midbrain and the forebrain, and the cerebral cortex, which is the forebrain. So you can read this if you want to. Notice how it talks about, it says the same thing. Subcortical structures are below the curly gray. This is cortical structures, are these structures. Below cortical structures are down here. So the limbic system's in both. Just, you know, because we're complicated. All right, an amygdala hijack is when all the blood flow of your brain leaves the higher order thinking part of your brain because it's the limbic system has interpreted the situation as an emergency, whatever situation you're in, and Hulk is a great example of that. So here's, this, when we're in a stressed state, more and more blood flow, the limbic system demands more and more blood flow, and as it does so, the way we think changes, because this part of our brain, the prefrontal lobes, where higher order thinking is occurring, is beginning to shut down. So as it begins to shut down, it's doing that so that all the blood flow in our body moves into our body for survival action. But it's not necessarily useful for modern life. This is for the complex situations we experience in modern life, like this guy who is getting mad on the telephone. We've all probably been there, or this woman who's stressed out. These are, most neuroscientists see these today as overreactions to the kinds of complex situations, overreactions by our nervous system. And there's it does it to us. We're designed to do this, to react to stress in these ways in order to survive. But our complex social situations of today, usually it's better to not react like this. But our brain sets us up to react like this, which is why training our brain to be in a calmer state is a helpful thing. And this is how the Navy SEALs actually trains their recruit in a program they call the Program for Mental Toughness. And it'll talk about the three-part brain and the limbic system in this video too, and reinforce these ideas. It's a pretty short clip, but it's a great one from a History Channel show on the brain. And I think you can watch the whole History Channel show. It's a really good show. It talks about other things too, like I think they've got something on a psychopath in there and things like that. So we're going to go back to this idea that when we're not under threat, we can make considered decisions and we can process things in a fairly sophisticated way. But if our amygdala system sentry picks up a threat, we start to not being able to think clearly. We are able to think quickly and urgently and move fast, but we're not able to think in complex ways. So what's happening? The blood flow is leaving the cerebral cortex, prefrontal lobes part of our brain. It's actually being inhibited by the amygdala so that all the blood flow, because it can't go everywhere, so it's going into survival mechanisms, right? So we lose the ability to use the thinking power of our prefrontal lobes, which are right behind the forehead. The emotions overwhelm thinking, and we have a reduced ability to accurately read other people's emotions, as well as a reduced ability to do anything like come up with creative ideas to our survival. When we are what's called under an amygdala hijack, that was a term, it's a useful term that was coined by Daniel Goleman, we think differently, right? We think about survival things, our thinking becomes immediate and impulsive. We have a sense of intense urgency. If you think about it, we feel like, oh, it has to be solved now, or the argument has to be solved now. But since we're not able to think, we've shut down the part of our brain that is best able to do things like understand other people's points of view and things like that, we tend to be not very good about anything but our own point of view when we're in these states. Right? So we become simplistic and narrow-minded in the way we think. Everything is their fault, nothing is my fault. And later, when we're able to get the rest of our brain online, we're able to understand that the bigger picture and more of the interceding variables that were involved in our reaction. We also have this thing that neuroscientists refer to as a negativity bias of the brain, meaning that we're sort of preset to have more negative emotions than positive, because negative emotions will keep us alive and positive emotions are secondary relative to that. So you can even see over here that relative to the primary limbic emotions, we have a wider range of sort of what we might call negative emotional spectrum than sort of the positive emotional spectrum. So this is something that, now that we're aware of this, and in modern society, we want to have, in general, a brain that we can manage the negative emotional systems and keep them at bay so that we can be constructive, right? And do positive things and enjoy our lives more and stuff. So being aware of this, we can actively work to cultivate, sort of the more positive emotional system and cultivate our own ability to regulate the negative emotional system. In fact, it's the inability to regulate negative emotional system that's behind most of the psychological disorders and major difficulties we face even. So here's another slide on the hippocampus related to memory. Just a reminder, there's our little hippo. So when you see hippo, think memory. Just for fun, because that's what it is. All right, and we already talked about emotional memory, but here's another thing to add, and that is the idea that memory is state specific. So when you hear that term, they're actually referring to your emotional state. So when we're in a good mood, we remember all the things that we love about our life, and when we're in a bad mood, we remember all the things that we're not happy with about our life, which is kind of unfortunate, really, because it makes it easy to perpetuate a bad mood, right? So something happens, puts you in a bad negative mood, that sends negative feelings into your system. You start thinking about the negative feelings, and that's reminding you of other things that you don't like, which sends more negative feelings to your limbic system, and it becomes this feedback loop that, now that we're aware of it, we can consciously work to interrupt so that we don't get into a negative spin, right? This slide just illustrates that the mammal brain is designed to weigh opportunities and threats. This poor little dog. Obviously, this will be a PTSD response. And what could groove into this little dog's brain is the sand. Sandy places could be what triggers his brain to associate that with danger, right? So one of the things about the negativity bias of the brain is that we over-remember negative experiences because they are related to survival, but not necessarily as important as previously, right? So think about, you have 5 great things that happen in a day, but one bad thing. What are you going to be mostly thinking about at night? It's that one bad thing, right? And that one negative thing somebody said to you, or the one low grade you got on the test or whatever. You're going to be shoving aside the positive things for the negative one, and your brain is sort of preset to do that. And it isn't always a good thing, right? So because some of those negative things that we stew on at light are not particularly all that important, right? So we can train ourselves to really take in more positive experiences and be careful about allowing ourselves to overgroove in too much of the negative ones, right? So this is a brain matching practice quiz that you can do just to get these basic parts down, right? These are the ones that you really want to know because they're dialogued about the most. And this is a short answer question about amygdala hijack and how does an amygdala hijack change the way that we think. And a good way to think about this is to think about the last time you saw an amygdala hijack. Like toddlers have them all the time, but we adults have them too when we get stressed out, and notice how it changes your behavior and how that influences the way you perceive the world or how other people perceive your world. And a couple other questions, and then I'm going to start talking a little bit more now. Let's talk about the nervous system. So we've got this, you already know that the central nervous system is the brain and spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system is all the other nerves that run through your body. Now we're going to add to this a little bit by looking at how the peripheral nervous system is broken into 2 parts, the somatic and autonomic. The somatic is voluntary actions, like moving your hand or standing up to go get a glass of water. And the autonomic is involuntary processes like heart rate, digestion, immune system, temperature, and perspiration. Now we can influence these, but they run by themselves, and thank goodness, because if they didn't, we would forget to beat our own hearts. In fact, one of the favorite things my son ever said to me, we were having a debate about, whether or not there is a God. He said, Mom, is it you who beats your own heart? Great question. Anyway, the autonomic system runs behind the scenes, and we can influence it. But it's an intelligent system that runs for us. So this is just to help you get those 4 ideas down. And now that autonomic system, which is the part that runs automatically behind the scenes, has 2 states. We're either, and you know, it's sort of like a scale of low to high. We're either in sympathetic arousal, where we're really aroused, or we're in parasympathetic arousal, which is rest or digest, or we're somewhere in between, right? So sympathetic is aroused, your system is on and energized, and it can be in fight or flight. If it's an extreme level, you're in fight or flight. Parasympathetic is when our system is relaxed and our body rests and digests. And if we don't spend enough time in this state, a relaxed state, which means mentally relaxed too, if we're internally worrying but physically lying down, we're still in a sympathetic state. I should repeat that. If we're mentally feeling like this, but we're physically still, our body is still in this state because adrenaline and cortisol, the stress hormones, are running through our body, but we're creating it with our mind, right? We're just not moving our body at the same time. So parasympathetic means you're feeling basically safe, you know, so that you can feel calm. That's why, you know, people can get ulcers if they don't spend enough time in mentally feeling safe, right? Mentally feeling calm. So here's another slide that illustrates the same thing. We have a calmer heart rate, increased stomach activity. Also, your immune system activity is most at work during parasympathetic. That's why you'll get sick more if you're stressed out too much. And again, mentally, you can sympathetically arouse yourself mentally as well, right? So sympathetic is related to stress or heightened activity. The pupils get bigger, breathing gets shallower, heart pumps faster, and the gut is inactive. All the blood flow goes to the extremities so that we can take action. And when we're calm, it's the opposite. The pupils expand so you can see more in the environment to survive. And when you're calm, parasympathetic system, everything calms down. So I think about that deer I saw again. And when I scared them, they went into stress. But then when I stopped following them, they calmed down and started to eat again, right? But we humans, you know, we get scared into stress, and then we mentally cogitate. See, the deer is not mentally cogitating. That's what's different about us in stress. So this is also sympathetic arousal, but depending on, well, he looks pretty confident. So my guess he's, you know, feeling exactly the right amount of excitement to be thrilled, and he's probably one of those big risk takers with smaller amygdala, right? Okay. Amygdala hijack, fight or flight. So sympathetic nervous system is aroused when we are having an amygdala hijack of fight or flight. And again, this is a picture of sympathetic arousal, fight or flight state, amygdala activation, which we want sometimes, right? If we need a lot of physical energy and we need to be aggressive, it's useful. So I mentioned before that we can get stuck in an amplified fight or flight response, and that's why the stress reduction practices can be so helpful. And there's lots of them, you know, running and exercise and laughing with your kids are stress reduction practices also. You're the one that needs to decide if you have enough of them to help modulate the activation of negative emotions that you have to experience, right? This is just how the fight or flight reaction runs through the body. And now neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are chemical messengers of the brain and nervous system. And you've heard of serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine, right? So they all interact, and you can see the interaction here. It's sort of like, you can think of these, and these are just a few of them, you know, and they interact also with the hormones like testosterone and estrogen, and we all have a little bit of different amounts of these. I like to think about and compare these to like making cakes or cupcakes or brownies or muffins, or, you know, they all take sugar and flour and water and eggs and some kind of oil, but in different amounts, and you end up with a little bit of a different thing, right? So that's what these are like. These to me are like sugar and eggs and flour and so on, and you mix them up in different amounts, and we all have them in different amounts, and they can be in different amounts. Serotonin is energy, you know, just having enough energy and alertness. You need serotonin. So when you wake up in the morning, you get serotonin is, you know, moving into your brain and replacing some of the sleep hormones, right? Like melatonin. And then dopamine is a reward system neurotransmitter that's related to motivation and drives and seeking things that we want. Norepinephrine, you know, epinephrine is a kind of is adrenaline, a form of adrenaline, and it's also alertness. So we need a little adrenaline, but not too much adrenaline, right? So it's like salt. A little adrenaline is great, but a couple of tablespoons and our system's overwhelmed. Serotonin is also a modulator of negative emotions. It helps dampen the surges of negative emotion that they get triggered by the amygdala, right? So something negative happens, and we need this modulator, right? And so you have to, again, think the distribution curve. People are going to be born with different amounts. Most people in the middle, and some people have a lot more serotonin, so they don't struggle with as many negative emotions, and some really low levels of serotonin, and that's just going to happen biologically. So just like, you know, some people are going to manage insulin really well, sugar really well, and other people are going to have trouble managing sugar, and so need insulin. So we have to take it as a given that these neurotransmitters that we're just beginning to learn about these neurotransmitters are electrical chemicals, which is weird, right? I mean, to me, I think about, like, you know, electrical, putting our outlet into, you know, like lightning mixed with bleach and lightning, you know, electrical chemicals, strange product that we don't really deal with in the regular real world. How many of us ever deal really with electrochemical products? But that's what these are, and we're really just beginning to understand them. So this is a brave new world to understand the neurotransmitters, and particularly the way they interrelate with each other and they interrelate with the hormones. And you're not going to need to memorize the neurotransmitters so much for this unit. I think you should know that serotonin is with alertness and managing negative emotion. Norepinephrine, this is epinephrine, this is adrenaline, which gives you alertness and energy, and you need in small doses, but in large doses, that's the stuff that turns you into Hulk, right? And then dopamine, which is pleasure seeking. Memorize that. But we're not going to go too much deeper than that, because there's only so much that you can do in 1 week, right? So here we have just another slide that shows us that when we're calm and relaxed, but still alert and interested, right? So not just kind of like zombied out, but alert and interested, then we have more cortical function up here. Then we have high intense emotion, we have less cortical function, which is the ability to process and think through and come up with new ideas and be creative and understand other people's points of view. Higher order human thinking sort of shuts down the higher, more intense the emotion. Good to know, because what you want to do is go do something that gets you back into this state and then deal with the problem, right? Get back into this state and then deal with the problem. And that's something to learn, because this is very compelling. It's going to demand your attention. All right, so we have another slide now on sympathetic and parasympathetic activation and neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are electrochemical messengers. Bleach and lightning. They're just crazy. All right, that's it, you guys. I'll do the next lecture slideshow mañana. Signing out.